Hey guys, I'm here at yet another amazing place on earth, Palouse Falls in central Washington, and I'm battling darkness to talk to you about how to bring together a lot of the concepts of information and technology that we've covered throughout the class, and to try and bring together those two threads in a way that'll help you to remember all the concepts we've talked about, but more importantly to really get used to applying the concepts that we've been talking about, to be able to use the concepts of technology and information to analyze any kind of information system that you come across. So let's see how far I get before the darkness gets in my way. So the first question is, are they related at all, information and technology? You know that I've said before that when you're creating an information system that you have to do some technology things, you have to do some people things, and you have to do some information things. And implicitly, I think you can see that those are all related, but exactly how are they related? Well, I said this before, and I want to use this as sort of a guiding principle for this lecture as well, and that's the idea that all of those things are in support of information, especially the technology. When we talk about an information system, the system is simply there to move around information, and particularly to move it from the people who have the information to the people who need the information. So when I fill out a form, I have some information, right? And the form is there, the electronic form on a website is there for me to give the information to the system, so that somewhere down the line the information can be used by somebody else who needs it. When I post something on Facebook, I'm providing information. So I have the information, and I think I want to give that information to all my friends who are going to connect with me on Facebook. Facebook also has some ideas about what kind of information I'm providing. When I go on Facebook and I take a series of user actions, Facebook is logging that. We've talked about that. That's the back-end data. And Facebook is simply there. It's simply a reason from this other perspective to collect up information about my behaviors and use them for the business purposes of Facebook. So you get the idea? The way that I like to think of the relation of information and technology is that technology is simply there to move the information around from those who have it to those who want it or need it. Okay, so let's go through the main sort of technological framework that I've given you, this idea of the tiers, the presentation tier and the processing tier and the data tier. And what I'd like to do is first review the concept, give you kind of the back through it in a quick sort of way, and then apply the concept to the idea of information and talk about what does information have to do with the processing tier? What does information have to do with the presentation tier, etc.? So let's start with the presentation tier. So we've talked about these ideas of thick clients and thin clients, and we know that Facebook and Google use this thin client, and the classic thin client is called a browser. And the reason that it's a thin client is because it has not a lot of programming in it, not a lot of smarts. And that the real action in the presentation tier of both Google and Facebook is going on in the server. So the way that we've discussed that is that the server is responsible for doing all the work, and it sends a pre-formatted HTML page back down to the browser. The browser's only job really is to display that. Now there is a little bit of code, there is a little bit of functionality in the browser, but it's very, very minor in those two situations compared to the amount of functionality that's on the server. So that's Google and Facebook. Their presentation tier is really mostly on the server. The browser is a thin client on your machine, on the client machine. That's really responsible just for display, with a very small amount of code in there that performs certain functions on the client. Okay, WoW, on the other hand, is a very different model. Right, we talked about World of Warcraft as having a very thick client, and that thick client is responsible for the display of everything. It's responsible for the animations that you see. It's responsible for your entire, and this is to get to the next point, your entire user experience. We've talked about the server, and the server really is mostly there to send data to the client, to send information to the client so that the client application, this fat client, knows what to do. Okay, so that's a review, a quick review of the presentation tier. Google and Facebook work one way, World of Warcraft works a very different way. But they both have presentation layers, and in all cases, the presentation layer is there to provide what? To provide the user experience. That's the whole idea of the presentation layer, and that's our first big connection. We have this concept from information of the user experience, where the user interacts with the system. The user is in some kind of dynamic dance with the system And what is that dynamic dance? The dynamic dance of the user with the system is supplying and consuming information. Think about any application that you use, any information system that you use, and that's what you're doing when you're interacting with it. You're supplying information to it, and you're consuming information from it. So another way of looking at the user experience is a way of organizing that supply and demand, the giving and taking of information. So let's start a content strategy up in the upper right-hand corner. How will the presentation meet our users and our organization's goals? So we create a presentation that's compelling to the users and that's useful to the people who are going to pay for the system. And that presentation is the presentation layer. So the structure of the presentation layer has to be linked back to the goals not only of the organization, but the goals of the users that are going to interact with that presentation layer. Then we have information architecture. We've talked about information architecture and the core of information architecture being the information model and the organization of the information. The presentation layer is responsible for the layout of that model. So in the background we have a model somewhere. The model is exposed, the model is presented in the presentation layer to the users using information architecture. The way that I lay out my information, how I show my different information types, how I show the different organizational structures of those information types is all part of the presentation layer. So the presentation layer, what is it presenting? It's presenting information. That's what it's presenting. And through the presentation of information, it's creating a user experience. Okay, continuing around the circle, the functionality. We've talked about functionality, and in fact, I just mentioned this idea before of the fat client and the thin client. The fat client and the thin client, they're still the presentation layer. And in all cases, the presentation layer has some set of functions, some set of functionality for laying out information, for providing different ways of controlling the information, for navigating around, for moving characters if you're in World of Warcraft, for fighting, etc., right? And that functionality is part of the presentation layer. The functionality is also what's being defined in the user experience. The user experience is all about what can you do. What can you do is functionality. Functionality is in the presentation layer. Okay, not that there's no functionality in the other layers, but the functionality that we usually think of, that we usually associate with applications, is really in the presentation layer. Okay, then around platforms, that's an easy one. What kind of different devices is this thing supposed to run on? That's part of the presentation layer as well. That's part of the user experience. Each different device has different abilities and different sort of things that it's good at and things that it's bad at. And so when we're creating a user experience, we have to take those things, for example, that a smartphone is good at, that a laptop computer isn't good at, or that a laptop computer is good at but a smartphone isn't good at. We have to take those things into account as well. Okay, then the user interface. We've talked a lot about the user interface being controls and content and decoration. Decoration is the surrounding, and the content is the information, and the controls are ways of interaction. Right? So that's also in the presentation layer. In fact, a lot of times people will talk about the user interface, and that's what they mean. They mean the presentation layer. The user interface is the skin on the presentation layer. That's the way that I like to think about it. That we have this presentation layer that consists of lots of functionality, lots of things that you can do, and the user interface is a skin on that functionality. Okay, then finally around the circle, and I think I'm going to have to end here because it's getting a little dark. Although this is the most amazing place. This is really a beautiful place. I could stay here for a long time, but I got here a little late in the day, but so, oh well. Finally, around the end of the end of the curve is usability and accessibility. Usability is, actually those two terms are together for a good reason. In general, usability is how possible is it for the kind of person that you want to use this system to be able to use the system. Trouble-free, they know what everything is, they know what to do when they want it, they have a task in mind, they know how to do it in the user interface, etc., etc. So accessibility really is usability for alternative types of people. Usability in general is can the kind of person that you want to use this system, can they use it? Are they able to use it? And that's also in the presentation layer. All that usability and accessibility, when you test the usability of an application, that's what you're testing. You're testing the presentation layer to make sure that the presentation layer is okay. Okay, so all around the circle we have user experience. User experience, as I've defined it at least, and this is undoubtedly an information-centric view because I'm an information guy. So my view of it is information-centric, and my view of user experience is that user experience is all about providing and supplying and getting consuming and creating information. And that's what the user experience is about. If it's a good user experience, it facilitates people who have the information to give it to people who want or need the information. Okay, I guess that's about enough for tonight, because I'm getting rained on and it's getting dark. All right, let's pick up where we left off. But now I'm at Schweitzer in Idaho. First day of the ski season. I was supposed to go to Canada, but I forgot my passport, and so they turned me around at the border. So this is all right. It's really nice. Unfortunately, it was really nice this morning. You could see this big lake Pondere out in the distance, but now now it's snowing, of course. So let's pick up where we left off, and hopefully I won't ruin my gear as I talk to you. Where we left off was at the presentation tier. I want to go on to the processing tier. And so let me start with a little bit of a review of the processing tier. This you should all kind of remember from before. The processing tier, from an information standpoint, really is sort of a switchboard. It's a switchboard between the data tier, where information is stored long term, and the presentation tier, where information is created and displayed. So that's the way to think, or at least from an information standpoint, that's the way to think about the processing tier. It does lots of work. It validates things. So if you're supposed to type in a date and you didn't type in a date, you typed in something else, it'll tell you that sort of thing. It does calculations. So if for example, you have to put in a date that's before a certain date, it might check that the date is greater or less than a certain date. And it also will do manipulations. So for example, it might take an image that you had uploaded before and resize it and turn it into a thumbnail and do a bunch of stuff like that. So that's the sort of stuff that happens on the processing tier. But at the largest level, at kind of the high level, what we want to think about this processing tier is it sends and receives information to the client, to the presentation tier, which in many cases is the client, but we know from WoW isn't always just, or we know from Facebook, for example, isn't always just the client, like the browser. And it also sends in and receives information from the data store. So at this highest level, this processing tier is a way to switchboard between the long-term storage of the information in the data tier and the short-term display and creation of information on the presentation tier. So let's... All right. I think it's time for me to pack up and find a more sheltered place to do this. I'm going to ruin all my equipment. All right, let's try that again. I came down a little lower, it stopped snowing. It's a lot calmer down here, and so let's see if I can do some work here. Okay, so let's quickly review the processing tier. Processing tier, you'll remember, is where the core functions of the system happen. And in the world of Warcraft, a lot of the core functions of the system happen on the client, in that fat client. In Google and Facebook, on the other hand, none of that stuff happens on the client. So the processing tier is all on the server in the world in Facebook and Google, but it's split between the server and the client in the World of Warcraft system. So we have a situation where in the processing tier, the presentation tier in Google and Facebook is split between the server and the client. It's the processing tier that's split between the server and the client in the World of Warcraft. Okay, so think about that. We have the presentation tier, we have the processing tier, then we have the client and the server. They make different decisions about what should go on the client and what should go on the server. And at this point, I think you should be able to guess a little bit about why they've made those different decisions. The data tier, of course, is all about information. That's the idea of the data tier, is to create a permanent storage area for the information. And you'll remember that I've said in the past that we have lots of temporary storage areas, and we call those caches. And we have one permanent storage area, and we call that the data tier. And in the data tier, we have some persistent storage area. In the case of the World of Warcraft system, that persistent storage area is a relational database, and we've talked lots about relational databases in the past. In Facebook and Google, that persistent storage layer is a lot more complicated than a relational database. It was a relational database at some point. Then they got too big and they got too many transactions, and they had to go with something that was more fast and agile than a relational database. Okay, so in Facebook and Google, they group together because they have data stores that are just too large and too many transactions to be a traditional relational database. And the World of Warcraft, they can be a traditional relational database. But in either case, what's going on in this data tier is the storage of the information model, as we've talked about before, and the storage of the actual data in, if it's a relational database, in tables, rows, and columns. If it's not a relational database, in something that we haven't really talked about because it's too complex for us to go into in this class. Now let's follow information all the way from the data tier to the presentation tier, and even prior to really the storage in the data tier, from the data model all the way through to the user interface where that information is presented. So we're going to follow the path of information. So starting from the information model, you know we have the idea of types and attributes, value patterns, relationships between types. Then we have items and values. The items are one chunk of information. If the type is a person, if the type is people, then an item is one person. Hopefully that's starting to really sink in for you at this point. And then those things map very cleanly to concepts in the data in a relational database, as well they should. In a relational database, we have representations of all these things. And as we said before, the types in a relational database are represented as tables. The attributes are represented as columns. The value patterns are called data types. And I've said that data types are pretty much the same as value patterns, except there's a lot in value patterns that we don't typically classify as a data type. We have items, and each of those items is, we have relationships. And the relationship between types is called a schema in a relational database. We have items. The items map to a row. So a row in the people table is one person. And we have the type people, and we have the item one person. Same thing happens in the database. We have the table called people, and one row in that table is a person. Now, I've oversimplified this. It's not usually one table per info type. They're much more complicated than that. And they could be dozens of tables participating, but let's just keep it simple for this present discussion. And then the values in the information model are the cells of a database. So if I open up a database table and I look at one cell, that's one value. Okay, and then then we have queries. Queries are what gets information out of the data tier. Now we've switched from the data tier to the processing tier. I'll locate the queries on the processing tier, and that's usually how it happens. The processing tier formulates a query, sends that query to the data tier. The data tier retrieves the information and sends it back to the processing tier. And we know that the from part of a query gets at tables. The columns, the select part of the query gets at columns. And finally, the where part of the query gets at rows. So you can see a direct mapping between the information model, the database, and the query that we use to get stuff out of the database. Okay, and then finally, in the user interface, we have these notions of page types, page areas, and page subareas, something we talked about way back in the beginning of the class. A page type is a certain kind of page. So for example, if it's people we're talking about, there may be a people type of page. If it's products we're talking about, there may be a product type of page. And that's really mapping to the type. Each type of information usually has its own type of page. And that makes sense, right? I have a specific display for a particular type of information, and a different type of information has a different display in that presentation tier. Okay, data tier, processing tier, presentation tier. Presentation tier has page types, and the page types map to tables. It has page areas, and each of those page areas usually has all of the information from one row, from one item of information in it. And the page sub-areas, inside those areas, we can break a page area down into smaller and smaller bits, and those smaller and smaller bits contain the attributes. Okay, so now I've traversed theoretically all the way from data to presentation. Let's do it in actuality using a particular example. We're going to return to Pandora here and chart the path of a song from the database all the way to the user interface, from the data tier all the way to the presentation tier. Okay, so first we're going to start with this information model. Here's the information model of a song. At this point, it should start to be pretty clear to you what's going on here. The big blue blobs are types. The orangish colored ones are attributes. The orange arrows between the types specify the relationships between types. And inside of the attribute, I have the name of the attribute and a sample of one value of the attribute. Okay, I could have also put in here value patterns, but I don't think we need that for this example. Here is the information model of a song. Now let's look at the schema for a song. I think you'll see that there's really a direct mapping. We have 3 types, and each type has a table. Each of these boxes is a table. We have different attributes inside here. We're not showing any sample values of the attributes, but we are showing all the attribute names. And then we're drawing lines between the tables to show the relationships. So we have tables, we have attributes, And we have relationships all modeled in here. And of course, you know that if I was to click in the right place inside the database, I'd see all the information about the value patterns, which in the database are called data types. Okay, so data model maps to database. Database then gets queried. And so here's a query. Select a bunch of fields from the artist, song, and recording table where the artist ID equals 1. Now you see in this picture, I still have a picture of the schema up in the corner, but now I have the 3 tables. And these are not in the view of the structure of the table, but in the view where I can actually see the values. In this view, those tables look a lot like a spreadsheet would look. And so you can see values in each of these tables. Oops, I'm falling into this tree. You can see values. You can see values in this database in these 3 tables for all the different things that I have in my model. This happens to be a song by a woman named Missy Higgins, and it's on a particular album. And it's well, we have the artist. Yeah, we have the artist named Missy Higgins. We have the song called "The Sound of White," and the recording, which is also called "The Sound of White." It's the title track from the recording. Okay, and then we run this query. Now where are we? We're no longer in the data tier here. Now we're in the processing tier. The processing tier runs this query, and out comes the results. Notice it looks like one big database table with all of those attributes, with all of those columns next to each other. And that gives us all we need to fill up a user interface. So we've gone from data model, and we've seen how the data model is mapped to a database structure. Now we've seen how that database structure is queried by a query, and that query selects tables and rows and columns, and it puts them all together into what I show at the bottom here, which is a result. This is a database result. Now this isn't something that you would want to look at as an end user. As an end user, you want to look at a user interface. So one last step is to go to the user interface. We now have a picture of a page on Pandora for this very song. The page type is a song. We know that the design of this page is meant to show a song. But notice in this case we have not only songs available to us, but we also have artists and recordings. So this page, in addition to showing song information, is also showing artist and recording information. We have a page area here, and I pointed to that page area that has the cover art from the recording. But notice that that page area isn't only, that page area has recording information, but also other places on the page also have recording information. Down below there, you see it says from the Sound of White. And so the point here is that it's not so clean in this particular screenshot that each page area is mapping to a table. Oftentimes that's the case. Oftentimes very distinct parts of the page are mapping to the different artist, song, and recording information. It just so happens that here they decided to mix them all up. But now we can see one particular page sub-area. That's the play button up here. And I linked the play button. If you look down at the bottom, I have the same results from the previous screen in here. So these are the results of the query. Here's the query right here. I run this query against the database structure, which I'm now no longer showing. I get the results that are at the bottom of the image. And one of those results, it's called the sound file, is part of this little piece of user interface. That's the widget that runs the sound file, that plays the sound file. Each one of the other pieces of information maps to a different place on the screen. It's worth your time in this case to go through and look at where each of these values maps on the screen, and to figure out where each of the columns that I returned in the results shows up on this piece of user interface. Okay, so to review, I took one piece of data all the way from, this is like a slope, it's hard to stand on. I took some information and I ran it all the way from the information model through the database structure, through a query that retrieves a certain amount of that based on the query that I run, to the user interface, where the results of that query are laid into a display in the presentation layer, are laid into a display for you to consume. Now let's go in the other direction. I'm going to go from the user interface now back to the database. And I'm going to go through the processing tier to get there. So I have the presentation tier, the processing tier, and the data tier. Now I'm going in the other direction. Before I went from the data tier to the presentation tier, now I'm going to go from the presentation tier to the data tier. In the first case, I was displaying information that had previously been saved somehow. In this case, I'm saving new information. So once again, I have this idea that the entire system really is about displaying and saving information, creating new information, and showing information that's already been created. So in this case, I have the presentation tier. I have page types, input controls, and action controls. So the page type, as before, is all about which type of information is this page concerning. The input controls are now all about which columns I want to update. So I have page types, and the page type in this case, let's call it, well, we'll get to the example in a moment, but the page type is, for example, a person. And the table to update is the people table. And the input controls are all the attributes of a person, because if I'm going to update the people table, I have to know what I'm updating, the name, the address, the email, the phone number, etc., right? So all those input controls, and what does it mean for it to be an input control? It means that you somehow choose it or type into it or select it in some way to say what it is you want to store in the database. And so then I have action controls like the submit button or the clear button or the reset button or the delete button. All of those buttons that make certain things happen to this information are additionally on the page. Okay, the action controls map to algorithms. When I click one of those actions, it says which algorithm do I want to perform, an update algorithm, a delete algorithm, a change algorithm, whatever. The input controls all map to attributes, as I said, columns and rows to update. And then the page types map to the tables that I want to update in the database. Okay, and so in the data tier, the page type maps through tables into a particular table. And the input controls map to a column. And if I was to go back another layer to the data model, I would be, instead of calling them columns, I would be calling them attributes. Okay, so one more thing to talk about before I move into an example of this is how this maps for functions. We have the presentation tier, the processing tier, and the data tier. Remember what a function is? A function has a purpose, a user interface, a procedure, algorithms, and some impact on data. Notice how those functions span across all of these different layers. I have in the presentation layer the purpose, so the user has some purpose in using this user interface. There is some user interface, some set of controls and decorations and content that specify the user interface. And then there's the action controls that tell what procedure, and there's a procedure that I use in order to update all of that. Okay, then on the processing tier I have the algorithms. That's the actual doing something. That's the processing of the information that I've specified in the presentation tier. And then finally, on the data tier, obviously, I have the impact on data. All right, let's look at an example. Let's look at an example of this. We have people in Pandora, and I've used a very simple example here. And the simple example is creating a new account. So I have a page type. I'm going to call this page type people because it's all about a person record or a person item. Can you see that? This is all about a person item. This is all different things that we know about a person. And if we were to map this back to the data model, it would be all about the person type. All we have to do in this case is map it back to the people table in the database, and the people table is also all about the people type. I have my input controls, and these are all the places where I type in information or in some way specify the information about a particular person. And then finally I have the action controls. One is register and the other one is cancel. When I click register, it's going to do a function. Let's call it, it's going to invoke an algorithm. That algorithm is put a new record in the people table and create a new user for Pandora. Right? If I click cancel, it might delete a database record that I had created before or something like that. Okay, so here's the user interface. User interface has a page type that maps to the information type that the page is about. It has a set of input controls that map to all the attributes or all the columns that type has, or at least the ones that we care about in this piece of user interface. And then we have action controls that tell us what to do with the data that's on here. Okay, now let's look at the processing tier. So the page we want to update here is the table that we want to update here is the people table. The columns that we want to update are all of the columns that we have input screens for, or input controls for. Email, password, birth year, zip code, gender. Do we want to send mail to this person, and have they agreed to our policies? The rows to update. Well, in this case, there is no existing row because I'm updating a new user, and so as I said something that's mistaken before about the cancel button. The cancel button can't delete a row because we haven't created a row yet. The function, the single function of this page, of this people page, is to create a new row. So one new row for the new person who's registering. And then the algorithms to use, well, we have maybe 3 algorithms running here. The first one is about validation. Is each of the things that they typed in valid? Did they type in a valid email name? If they didn't, go no further. Give them a message and tell them to do it again. Did they type, did they click both boxes? You know, whatever the rules of of what I want them to do on that screen are. Did they put only one word in the first name or something like that? Okay, so validate, second algorithm that I'm going to do. And when I say do an algorithm, I mean run the code that implements the algorithm, run the code that creates the programming for this particular algorithm. So I can validate, I can create a row, and that's my second kind of algorithm that I might do, creating a new row in the people table. And so just as I could query the people table from the processing layer, I can also create a new row in the people table from the processing layer. And then the cancel function, maybe what the cancel function does, instead of deleting a row, maybe the cancel function blanks out all the fields in the page, and so they can start over again. Okay, so you get the idea. We have the user interface that the user puts information in. We have the processing tier, and in the processing tier we have different functions, or excuse me, different algorithms that we're going to execute when we're in the processing tier. And now let's move on to the data tier. Okay, what the processing server does, we have the database tier, and the database tier, let's say, and probably this is the case in Pandora, is on a separate server than the processing tier, which is on a separate server. So I have two different servers involved here. I have a client, and the client in the case of Pandora is a thin client. It's just a web browser. The processing tier is on its own server, and the data tier is on its own server. So we have a processing server and a database server. The processing server sends all the information as well as the command to create a new row to the database server, and the database server stores all that information inside of the people table. So you see I have an example of the people table here. I have an example of the processing server sending the information to the database server, and the database server storing it permanently in the people table. Okay, so I've run information forward, and I've run information backwards. I've run it all the way from the data model, from the information model through the database, through the processing tier, and into the user interface in the presentation tier. Then I've gone the other direction and run it all the way from the presentation tier, where the user types in certain values, through the processing tier that performs certain algorithms on the values that the user types, and then finally into the data tier, where it's stored permanently and where it can be retrieved later by some other piece of user interface.